Alright, settle in friends. Tonight we're not spinning yarns of dashing knights or forbidden romances behind castle walls. We're heading into a far less glamorous, frankly, far more depressing corner of the medieval world, prisons. Now before you picture something out of a storybook, let's ditch those rose-tinted glasses right now. We're not talking about quaint stone towers with charmingly rusty locks. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Forget any notion of noble prisoners languishing with dignity, pensively gazing out barred windows. The reality was, well, let's just say Dante probably got a few ideas from these places. So why talk about prisons? Because they offer a brutally honest window into medieval society. They tell us about justice, punishment, social control, and what people really thought of those who broke the rules. Think of it this way: prisons reflect a society's deepest fears and its ugliest solutions. And the medieval period, it was rife with both. Now I know what you might be thinking. Medieval prisons? Surely they were just dungeons, right? Well, yes and no. The term dungeon conjures up images of dark, subterranean chambers, and that wasn't always the case. But let's not mistake that for better. It's more like trading one flavor of awful for another. Imprisonment in the Middle Ages wasn't just about punishment. It was often a holding pen, a place to keep people before trial while awaiting ransom, or simply until someone decided what to do with them. Forget any kind of speedy trial. You might be stuck in one of these places for months, even years, with no guarantee of ever seeing justice, or at least what passed for justice back then. The physical conditions? Unimaginable. Most medieval prisons weren't purpose-built facilities. They were repurposed rooms in castles, gatehouses, town halls, even monasteries. Think cold, damp stone, minimal light, and absolutely no sanitation. Imagine the smell: unwashed bodies, human waste, rotting food. Yeah, it wasn't a spa day. Disease was rampant: typhus, dysentery, plague. These weren't just words in a textbook. They were death sentences waiting to happen. A medieval prison could be less a place of correction and more a breeding ground for epidemics. And let's talk about food, or rather, the lack of it. Prisoners were often reliant on the charity of their families, friends, or, in some cases, the generosity or lack thereof of their jailers. If you were poor and friendless, you were pretty much left to starve. Water, often contaminated, if available at all. Hygiene, non-existent. Think about living in those conditions, day in and day out, surrounded by despair, sickness, and the constant threat of violence. Speaking of violence, medieval prisons were not safe spaces. Jailers were often corrupt and brutal, extracting what they could from inmates through extortion and torture. Other prisoners could be just as dangerous, forming their own hierarchies and preying on the weak. This wasn't a place for rehabilitation. It was a brutal dog-eat-dog world where survival was the only goal. And torture, it was a common method of extracting confessions, punishing inmates, and simply asserting authority. We're talking about things that would make your stomach churn: racks, thumbscrews, starvation, sleep deprivation. The list goes on. Let's be clear, the goal wasn't just to get information, it was to inflict pain and break the spirit. So who ended up in these awful places? Well, it wasn't just hardened criminals, although they were definitely there. You had debtors, people who simply couldn't pay their bills. You had political prisoners, those who dared to challenge the ruling powers. You had religious dissenters, those who deviated from the accepted doctrines of the church. You had petty thieves, vagrants, and the unfortunate souls who just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. And women, oh, the women. They faced unique vulnerabilities in medieval prisons, subject to sexual assault, exploitation, and often accused of crimes they didn't commit. Their stories are particularly harrowing, highlighting the stark inequalities of the time. Let's also dispel the idea that prison was a great equalizer. Medieval society was fiercely hierarchical, and that hierarchy extended even behind bars. The wealthy could often buy their way to better conditions, bribe the jailers, or even secure early release. The poor, as always, bore the brunt of the suffering. So as we delve into the secret history of medieval prisons, remember this: we're not going to find any romance or heroism here. What we will find is a stark reflection of a brutal and unforgiving world. A world where justice was often arbitrary, punishment was cruel, and the lives of the incarcerated were cheap. It's a depressing topic, I know, but it's an important one. It helps us understand the past, and hopefully it helps us appreciate the progress we've made, even if we still have a long way to go. Now, take a deep breath, and let's descend into the depths. It's going to be a long night. Okay, let's settle in, friends. Before we get to the grand castles and proper prisons we often picture, let's gently drift back, way back, before the year 1000. Think of this as pre-prison history. A time when concepts like incarceration were, well, a little more rustic. We're talking about a world where legal systems were patchy, to say the least. Forget standardized sentencing guidelines, or even consistent application of the law. Justice, or what passed for it, was often local, personal, and frequently rather arbitrary. So what did they do with people who broke the rules? Well, the most basic, and probably most common, method was simply holding them. Think temporary. Think makeshift. We're not talking about stone cells with iron bars just yet. Imagine a strong room in a chieftain's hall, or a space cleared out in a fortified home, or, even simpler, a sturdy wooden cage in the center of a village. These were places where someone accused of a crime, or perhaps awaiting trial by ordeal, or simply owed someone money, might be kept for a while. Conditions? Let's just say they weren't exactly 5-star. Light was probably minimal, ventilation even less so. Sanitation? Likely non-existent. Food was whatever someone felt like giving you, which probably wasn't much, and certainly wasn't predictable. And comfort? Well, you were probably sleeping on the floor, maybe with some straw if you were lucky. Think damp, think cold, think profoundly unpleasant. Now, the concept of the dungeon is one that's definitely seeped into popular imagination. And while true, dedicated dungeons did exist in later medieval castles, their origins are much more humble. The word dungeon, you see, comes from the Old French word donjon, which simply meant the main tower, or keep, of a castle. So initially, the dungeon was a place of safety, of strength. But over time, the lower levels of these keeps, well, they became convenient places to lock people up. These early dungeons, if we can even call them that, weren't necessarily designed as prisons. They were often storage areas, or cellars, or even just the lowest, darkest, most inaccessible part of a tower. The kind of place you wouldn't want to be, even if you weren't incarcerated. They'd likely be damp, often underground, and accessible only by a ladder or a narrow winding staircase. Perfect for keeping someone out of sight and out of mind, wouldn't you agree? And the thing about these primitive holding cells is that they weren't really about punishment, at least not primarily. They were about control, preventing someone from causing further trouble, ensuring they were available for whatever justice the local lord or community decided upon. It wasn't so much about reforming the wrongdoer, more about making sure they couldn't wrong again. Think about the social context. In these early medieval societies, personal relationships were everything. Kinship ties, oaths of loyalty, these were the bonds that held communities together. Breaking these bonds could have serious consequences. If someone committed a crime, it wasn't just an offense against the law, it was an offense against the community, and perhaps most importantly, against the victim and their family. So, imprisonment, even in these basic forms, often served as a way to mediate these conflicts. It was a way to hold the offender accountable, to give the victim and their family time to consider their options. Perhaps they would demand compensation, were guild it was often called, a payment for the wrong that had been done, or perhaps they would seek revenge. And in a world where personal feuds were common, the threat of revenge was a very real deterrent. Interestingly, even in this early period, we start to see some differentiation in how people were confined. Those of higher social standing, even when accused of crimes, might be held in relatively more comfortable conditions. Perhaps they'd be kept in a room within a castle rather than a truly subterranean dungeon. They might be allowed visitors or given better food. Social status, it seemed, could buy you slightly less miserable captivity. It's also important to remember that, while imprisonment was certainly used, it wasn't necessarily the default punishment. Fines, public shaming, corporal punishment, even exile, these were all common ways of dealing with offenders. Imprisonment was often reserved for those who were considered particularly dangerous, or who had repeatedly broken the law, or who simply couldn't afford to pay a fine. Now, picture this. A dimly lit, smoky hall, a local lord surrounded by his advisors and members of the community, an accused thief standing before them, perhaps shackled or bound. The atmosphere is tense, the air thick with expectation. What will happen to this person? Will they be fined, flogged, exiled, or will they be thrown into that dark, damp room to await an uncertain fate? These are the kinds of scenes that played out countless times in early medieval Europe. A world without formal police forces, without established court systems, without the relative comforts of modern prisons. A world where justice was often harsh, arbitrary, and deeply personal, and where the earliest forms of confinement were simply a way to keep people out of trouble until someone decided what to do with them. So as you drift off to sleep, imagine yourself in that dimly lit hall. Feel the tension in the air, hear the murmurs of the crowd, sense the uncertainty hanging over everyone involved. This is the world of early confinement, before the rise of castles, before the establishment of formal prisons. A world where imprisonment was just one piece of a much larger, much messier, much more human puzzle. Alright, settle in, because tonight we're not just talking about tums, or rather how homes, particularly castles, became dungeons. We're going to explore the rise of castles and keeps, and how they became absolutely central to imprisonment practices in the medieval world, not just for the really important baddies, but for everyday folks too. Before we dive in, let's think about what a castle actually is. It's not just a pretty backdrop in a fairy tale, right? It's a statement, a declaration of power, a big spiky keep-out sign made of stone. And in the medieval period, owning a castle meant owning a certain amount of, well, everything within its walls, and often quite a bit outside those walls too. That included the right to administer justice, or depending on your perspective, injustice. Now, early medieval justice, that's a whole tangled web of local customs, baronial decrees, and the occasional intervention from a king who probably had more pressing matters to attend to, like keeping his own crown on his head. There wasn't a centralized police force hauling people off to state-run prisons. Instead, justice was often a very personal, very local affair, and if you happened to upset the lord of the local castle, well, you might find yourself experiencing his personal brand of justice firsthand. So how did castles become prisons? Well, initially, the primary function of a castle keep was defense, of course. It was the strongest part of the castle, the last refuge in case of attack. But a secure, defensible space is also conveniently a pretty good place to hold someone against their will. Think about it. Thick stone walls, minimal windows, one heavily guarded entrance, perfect for keeping people in. Now, the kinds of people who ended up in castle dungeons varied wildly. For the nobility, imprisonment in a castle keep could be a political tool. Maybe a rival lord was getting a little too ambitious. A few years in a dark, damp cell might curb his enthusiasm. Or perhaps a member of the lord's own family had become a nuisance, a rebellious son, a scheming cousin, a wife who asked too many questions. Castles offered a convenient solution for dealing with these internal problems, far away from prying eyes. But it wasn't just the upper crust who faced castle imprisonment. Commoners too could find themselves behind bars, or rather behind stone walls. Petty theft, unpaid debts, poaching on the lord's land, insubordination, all could land you in the castle dungeon. And unlike the nobles, who might at least be afforded a modicum of comfort and respect, depending on the lord of course, the common folk were often treated with, well, let's just say minimal consideration. The conditions in these castle prisons, let's just say you wouldn't want to book a weekend getaway. Dungeons were often located in the lowest levels of the keep, below ground. Think damp, dark, and very, very cold. Sunlight, a luxury. Fresh air, even more so. Sanitation, practically non-existent. Imagine the smell, a charming blend of mildew, human waste and despair. Cozy, right? And the amenities. Well, you might get a handful of straw to sleep on. Maybe. Food was often meager and of poor quality. Think stale bread, watery soup, and the occasional rat, though that might have been part of the food. Water could be contaminated, leading to illness. And speaking of illness, disease was rampant. Cramped conditions, poor sanitation, and weakened immune systems made dungeons breeding grounds for all sorts of nasty ailments. But beyond the physical discomfort, there was the psychological toll. Imagine being locked away in darkness, with nothing but the slow drip of water and the occasional scuttling sound to keep you company. Isolation, sensory deprivation, and the constant uncertainty about your fate could drive even the sanest person to the brink. Now, it's important to note that not every castle had purpose-built dungeons. In many cases, imprisonment was more ad hoc. A spare room, a storage cellar, even a particularly sturdy tower could be pressed into service as a holding cell, and the level of security varied widely. Some castles had elaborate locking systems and heavily guarded cells, others not so much, which of course led to the occasional escape attempt. We'll get to those later. So what does all this tell us? Well, it shows us that castles weren't just defensive structures or fancy homes. They were also instruments of power, used to control and punish the population. They represent the physical manifestation of a hierarchical society, where the lord of the castle had the right to imprison, and often mistreat, those who fell afoul of his authority. It's a reminder that justice in the medieval period was often arbitrary, subjective, and heavily influenced by social status. And it shows that while we might romanticize castles in our fairy tales, their history is often much darker and grimmer than we imagine. A dark, damp, and probably rat-infested history, to be precise. Now, as a side note, let's remember that just because someone was imprisoned in a castle doesn't necessarily mean they were guilty of anything. Accusations were easy to make, and evidence was often, well, let's just say circumstantial. Personal grudges, political rivalries, and religious intolerance all played a role in who ended up behind bars. Being in the wrong place at the wrong time could be a one-way ticket to a castle dungeon. It's a stark reminder that the medieval legal system was far from perfect, and that innocent people undoubtedly suffered within those stone walls. And that's the thing about castles, isn't it? They stand as imposing symbols of power, but they also whisper tales of oppression, injustice, and the human cost of unchecked authority. So next time you see a picture of a beautiful medieval castle, remember that behind those picturesque walls lies a history that's often far more uncomfortable than the storybooks would have you believe. Sweet dreams. Alright, settle in, because we're about to journey into a slightly less dusty, but still pretty fascinating, corner of the medieval world, the intersection of the church and confinement. Now, when we think of medieval prisons, images of dark, dank dungeons in castles probably spring to mind. And we've talked a lot about those already, but what about the church? Surely those pious souls weren't throwing people in the slammer, were they? Well, yes they were, but with a slightly different twist. See, the church held significant sway over medieval society, and that included a role in dispensing justice. They had their own courts, their own laws, canon law, as it was known, and yes, their own methods of punishment. These weren't necessarily designed to be as overtly brutal as some of the secular prisons, although that wasn't always the case, but they still involved confinement, often with the aim of spiritual correction. The primary institutions involved were monasteries and other religious houses. Monasteries, typically quiet places of prayer and study, also served as places of detention. Not for the general populace, mind you, but primarily for members of the clergy who had strayed from the righteous path. Think of it as a sort of spiritual rehabilitation center, but with stone walls and a very strict schedule. So what sort of offences might land a monk or a priest in a monastic prison? Well, anything from simple disobedience and breaking monastic vows to more serious crimes like theft, violence, or even heresy. The goal wasn't necessarily to inflict pain, but to isolate the offender, allowing them to reflect on their sins and seek repentance through prayer and penance. Now, the conditions within these ecclesiastical prisons varied. Some were little more than solitary cells, perhaps a small, dark room with just enough space to lie down, and a small opening for food to be passed through. Others might have been more communal, with several offenders sharing a larger space. Regardless, life was far from comfortable. Imagine the quiet life of a monastery, but stripped of any comfort. Days filled with prayer, fasting, and manual labor. Limited contact with the outside world, and constant reminders of their failings. It was designed to break the spirit, not through physical torture, but through spiritual deprivation. And hey, it was probably pretty boring. But the church's role in confinement extended beyond just imprisoning its own members. They also played a role in punishing lay people, those outside of the clergy, for certain offences. This often involved penance, which could range from saying extra prayers or fasting, to making a pilgrimage, or yes, even confinement. One common form of ecclesiastical confinement for lay people was house arrest, but within a religious institution, like a convent or a monastery. This was particularly common for women accused of crimes like adultery or heresy. Instead of being thrown into a town jail, which could be a dangerous place, they were placed under the care of nuns or monks, who would supervise their activities and ensure they performed their assigned penances. The idea was that the religious environment would provide a space for spiritual reflection and reform. The nuns or monks would act as guides, offering instruction and support. It was meant to be a more compassionate alternative to secular imprisonment, focusing on rehabilitation rather than retribution. And hey, who knows, maybe it worked sometimes. Of course, not all ecclesiastical prisons were created equal. Some were known for their strict discipline and harsh conditions, while others were more lenient. And just like in secular prisons, there was always the potential for abuse. Power corrupts, and even within the church, that was a reality. We also have to consider the role of the Inquisition. Now, the Inquisition, established to combat heresy, often utilized imprisonment as a key tool. Suspected heretics were often held in church-run prisons while their cases were investigated. These prisons could be particularly harsh, as heresy was seen as a grave threat to the church and to society. The goal wasn't always to execute heretics. Sometimes the aim was to convince them to recant their beliefs and return to the fold. Imprisonment served as a means of coercion, a way to break their will and persuade them to renounce their heretical views. And hey, that's a pretty powerful motive for putting people in prison and just letting them sit in the dark. You could probably get away with a lot if you make a person believe they're there for their own good. So while the church's involvement in confinement might seem at odds with its image of compassion and forgiveness, it was a very real part of medieval life. These ecclesiastical prisons and forms of penance reflected the church's belief in the importance of spiritual correction and its role in maintaining order within society. And hopefully this helps paint a more complete picture of confinement practices during the medieval period, moving beyond just the typical dungeons and jails. Now let's move on to the urban centers of incarceration. Alright, let's settle in and talk about town jails and gatehouses, those urban centers of incarceration during the medieval period. When we think of prisons, our minds often jump to dark dungeons beneath imposing castles. And while those certainly existed, the reality is that most people who found themselves on the wrong side of the law in a medieval town or city would have experienced something rather different, though not necessarily better. Town jails, sometimes called jails, the spelling varied quite a bit back then, were a far more common sight than you might imagine. These weren't purpose-built structures in the way we might think of prisons today. Instead, they were often repurposed buildings, adapted to serve the needs of confinement. Think of a sturdy room in the town hall, a gatehouse archway, or even just a reinforced cellar beneath a market stall. Whatever was available and deemed secure enough. Gatehouses in particular were popular choices. These controlled access to the city, acting as both defensive structures and centers of administration. It made a kind of logical sense. You already had guards stationed there, a secure building, and a clear point of control. Slap some bars on the windows, reinforce the door, and bam, you've got yourself a jail. The gatehouse often had a room or two that could be easily converted, or maybe a pre-existing cellar that could be used. This wasn't always the case, of course, but the gatehouse was an important part of the medieval urban center. What set these urban jails apart was their location. Unlike the solitary castle dungeons, they were smack dab in the middle of town. This meant they were often noisy, crowded, and very, very public. Imagine being imprisoned right next to the hustle and bustle of the marketplace, constantly hearing the sounds of vendors hawking their wares, children playing, and the general hubbub of daily life. Conditions inside these town jails were, predictably, grim. Overcrowding was a chronic problem. Space was limited, and towns were often reluctant to spend much money on prisoner accommodations. You might find a dozen or more people crammed into a single small room, regardless of their crimes or social status. Men, women, and children were typically thrown together, regardless of their alleged offense. No segregation by age, gender, or crime. It was a free-for-all, and that led to a lot of issues. Sanitation, forget about it. Toilets were rudimentary, if they existed at all. Often it was just a bucket in the corner, which was rarely emptied. The resulting stench would have been overwhelming, especially in the summer months. And with so many people packed together, disease spread like wildfire. Typhus, dysentery, and plague were constant threats, and many prisoners died, not from their sentences, but from illness contracted within the jail walls. It was not good, and likely didn't make you want to be in the jail. Food was another major issue. Town jails weren't exactly known for their gourmet meals. Prisoners were often reliant on the charity of their families, or the goodwill of the townsfolk for sustenance. If you had no one to bring you food, you might very well starve. And even if you did have someone to provide for you, the quality and quantity of the food were often poor. Think stale bread, watery gruel, and maybe a bit of rancid cheese if you were lucky. This food didn't have all the vitamins you needed, and was likely hard to stomach as well. Security varied depending on the jail and the resources available. Some might have had solid stone walls and iron bars, while others relied on little more than a flimsy wooden door and a few rusty chains. Escapes were not uncommon, and jailers were often underpaid and overworked, making them susceptible to bribery or simply negligent in their duties. This would lead to more inmates in the prison and more overcrowding. Beyond the physical hardships, there was also the psychological toll of imprisonment. The constant noise, the lack of privacy, the fear of violence, and the uncertainty of your fate would have been incredibly demoralizing. Imagine being surrounded by strangers, some of whom might be violent criminals, with no way to escape or protect yourself. And of course there was the ever-present threat of violence within the jail. Petty theft, bullying, and even assault were common occurrences. The jailers often did little to intervene, either out of indifference or because they were simply outnumbered. Basically, jail wasn't a fun place to be. Interestingly, jailers weren't always paid a fixed salary. Instead, they often relied on fees from the prisoners themselves. This could include fees for better accommodations, a slightly less crowded cell, perhaps, or a bed, instead of sleeping on the floor. It also included fees for food, water, and even for having your chains loosened. This system created ample opportunities for corruption and exploitation, as gaolers were incentivized to squeeze as much money as possible out of their unfortunate inmates. So while town gaols and gatehouses might not have been as imposing as the dungeons we often picture, they were certainly no picnic. They were overcrowded, unsanitary, and dangerous places, where disease, starvation, and violence were constant threats. And for many who found themselves incarcerated within their walls, they were a death sentence in all but name. These gaols could be a death trap, but with luck, an inmate could survive. Alright. Let's settle in and talk about where these unfortunate medieval souls were actually kept. I'm talking about prison architecture. It's not exactly a glamorous topic, but understanding the physical spaces of medieval prisons is essential to understanding the whole experience. Now, forget any ideas you might have about well-lit, spacious cells. We're talking about spaces designed for control and, frankly, neglect. Security was paramount, of course, but the comfort and well-being of the prisoners, that was considerably less of a concern, shall we say. Medieval prisons, or gaols as they were often called, varied depending on location, the resources available, and who was being imprisoned. But some common themes run through them all. First, let's talk about location. Often prisons were incorporated into existing structures. Think about those castles we talked about earlier. The dungeons weren't just for show, they were a practical way to repurpose space. Town gaols might be located within the gatehouses, those fortified entry points to the city. This made sense from a security perspective, controlling the access points to the town and keeping the prisoners contained. Sometimes they were even built right into the town walls. Talk about a constant reminder of the consequences of breaking the law. The architecture itself was all about containment. Think thick stone walls. We're not talking about drywall, folks. These were walls that could withstand sieges, let alone escape attempts. Small, often single, doors reinforced with iron were the main points of entry and exit. These doors were heavily guarded, of course, and often had multiple locking mechanisms, and windows, well, they were a rarity, and when they did exist, they were tiny, high up, and often barred. The goal was to limit natural light as much as possible. Darkness was a key feature of medieval prisons, and it served a few purposes. First, it disoriented the prisoners. It's hard to plan an escape when you can barely see your hand in front of your face. Second, it contributed to a sense of despair and isolation. Imagine spending months or even years in near total darkness. It would be incredibly demoralizing. Ventilation was also a major problem. With limited windows and enclosed spaces, the air inside medieval prisons was often stale, damp, and foul-smelling. Remember, these weren't exactly spaces known for their sanitation, which brings us to sanitation, or rather, the distinct lack thereof. Medieval prisons were notoriously unsanitary. Human waste was often simply dumped in a corner or into a cesspit that might only be cleaned out occasionally. This created a breeding ground for disease, and as you can imagine, the smell was absolutely awful. Floors were often just dirt or stone, adding to the dampness and unsanitary conditions. Straw might be provided as bedding, but it was rarely cleaned and quickly became infested with vermin. Lice, fleas, and rats were constant companions for the prisoners. The layout of the prison itself was often quite simple. You might have a single large room where all the prisoners were kept together, regardless of their crimes or social status. Imagine the dynamics there. Or you might have a series of smaller cells, each holding a handful of prisoners. These cells were typically small and cramped, offering little room to move around. Below-ground dungeons often suffered with groundwater flooding and other conditions that would make them perpetually damp and cold. Security was paramount in the architecture. There might be multiple layers of security, with inner and outer walls and guarded checkpoints. Gaolers, or prison keepers, had complete control over access to the prison. Another feature that added to a prisoner's suffering were restraints. Chains were commonly used to secure prisoners, often shackling them to the walls or floor. These chains could be heavy and uncomfortable, and they limited movement, making it difficult to eat, sleep, or even relieve themselves. Sometimes prisoners were placed in stocks or pillories, which further restricted their movement and exposed them to public ridicule. Now, it's worth noting that there were some variations in prison conditions. Wealthier prisoners might be able to pay for better accommodations, perhaps a private cell with a window and better food. This, of course, created a stark divide within the prison population, with those who had money enjoying a degree of comfort while the poor suffered immensely. Also, ecclesiastical prisons run by the church were often different. These prisons, typically located in monasteries or other religious institutions, focused more on penance and spiritual reform than on punishment. While conditions might still be harsh, there was often a greater emphasis on prayer, reflection, and rehabilitation. But generally speaking, medieval prisons were grim, bleak, and unsanitary places. They were designed to control and contain, with little regard for the well-being of the prisoners. The darkness, the lack of sanitation, the cramped conditions, and the constant threat of disease all contributed to a miserable and often deadly experience. The architecture itself was a reflection of the medieval attitude toward crime and punishment, a focus on retribution and deterrence, rather than rehabilitation or reform. It's a rather unpleasant picture, isn't it? But it's important to remember these details because they shape everything else about the prison experience. Food, hygiene, social interactions, all of these were heavily influenced by the physical environment of the prison. So, with that image in mind, let's move on and talk about who actually ended up behind these bars. Alright, let's dim the lights a little further, shall we? Settle in, because we're about to take a closer look at exactly who ended up within the imposing walls of a medieval prison. It's not quite the rogues gallery you might be picturing. Now, the idea of a prison population in the Middle Ages is a little different than what comes to mind today. We're not talking about facilities filled exclusively with convicted criminals serving out lengthy sentences. Think of these places as more of a holding pen, a waiting room before a final judgment, or a place to simply put people that society didn't know what else to do with. First, let's talk about the debtors. Oh, the poor debtors. In a world where credit was often a handshake and interest rates could be utterly crippling, falling into debt was shockingly easy. And the consequences, well, they could be devastating. Imprisonment for debt was incredibly common. You owed your baker too much for bread. To the jail you go. Fell behind on your taxes to the local lord. Start getting used to the smell of damp stone. These weren't necessarily hardened criminals, mind you, but simply individuals struggling to make ends meet in a harsh economic climate. Imagine the despair, knowing that your very inability to earn money was keeping you locked away, making it even harder to repay what you owed. It's a cruel irony, isn't it? Then, there were the petty criminals. Think of these as the medieval equivalent of your neighborhood shoplifters, pickpockets, and public drunks. We're talking about people who committed minor offenses that disrupted the social order. A little pilfering from the market, perhaps, a brawl breaking out after a few too many ales. These weren't exactly criminal masterminds, but their actions landed them in the jail nonetheless. The severity of their confinement depended on the whims of the local authorities and the specific nature of their crime. A short stint in the stocks, maybe. A whipping and then release, quite possibly. A prolonged stay in the unsanitary depths of the local town jail, sadly, all too common. Now, things start to get interesting, and much more dangerous when we move on to political prisoners. Politics. Even in the Middle Ages, the Game of Thrones, or rather the game of power, was a brutal one. Disagree with the king, question the lord's authority, find yourself on the losing side of a succession dispute. You might very well find yourself cooling your heels in a dungeon, and for a very, very long time. Political prisoners ranged from nobles accused of treason to outspoken commoners who dared to criticize those in power. These individuals were often held in particularly harsh conditions, subjected to torture, and denied basic rights. Their imprisonment was less about justice, and more about silencing dissent and eliminating rivals. The Tower of London, which we'll discuss in more detail later, became particularly notorious for housing these unfortunate souls, a one-way ticket to a cold, dank cell. Of course, we can't forget the religious dissenters. The medieval church held immense power, and deviation from its doctrines was not tolerated. Heretics, blasphemers, and those accused of witchcraft often found themselves imprisoned, awaiting trial by ecclesiastical courts. Their confinement was often intended to encourage repentance and conversion, but it could also be a prelude to far more severe punishments, like being burned at the stake. Religious prisons, often located within monasteries or other religious institutions, held individuals deemed to be a threat to the spiritual well-being of society. Think of the quiet desperation of a monk, forced to renounce his beliefs in a cold cell. Beyond these main categories, there were also other types of individuals who ended up behind bars. Vagrants, beggars, and those deemed to be idle could be imprisoned for failing to contribute to society. Think of it as a very, very harsh form of social welfare enforcement. Suspected spies and foreign agents were also prime candidates for imprisonment, particularly during times of war or political unrest. Bandits and highwaymen, while often romanticized in folklore, certainly faced imprisonment if caught. And let's not forget those accused of various forms of moral crimes like adultery or prostitution, although punishment for these offenses varied greatly depending on the time and place. So as you can see, the prison population of the Middle Ages was a diverse and often unfortunate group of individuals. They were drawn from all walks of life, and their reasons for being incarcerated were just as varied. What united them all, however, was the harsh reality of medieval imprisonment, the squalor, the disease, the ever-present threat of violence, and the uncertainty of their fate. It wasn't a pleasant place to be, and even for crimes that seem minor today, an extended stay behind bars was all but a death sentence to even the most hardy soul. It makes you appreciate the relative comforts of modern life, doesn't it? Alright, let's settle in and gently explore life inside a medieval prison. It wasn't exactly a spa day, to put it mildly. We're talking about food, hygiene, or rather the lack of it, and the ever-present shadow of disease. Imagine waking up, well, existing, really, in the perpetual gloom. Sunlight, a rare visitor at best. Your stomach is gnawing, a constant reminder of its emptiness. Food in medieval prisons was, let's be generous and call it basic. Actually, let's be honest and call it awful. Generally, there was no official food allowance. That's right, not officially at least. Survival often depended on your ability to pay the gaoler, the prison warden, for sustenance. And let's just say jailers weren't exactly known for their generosity. The less they spent on you, the more profit they pocketed. Charming, isn't it? If you had money, you might be able to purchase bread, often stale and mouldy, mind you. Perhaps some watered-down ale. Maybe, a bit of cheese, crawling with, well, extra protein. If you were lucky. Those without funds, they relied on charity, handouts from sympathetic locals, or the kindness, which was rare, of other prisoners. But charity was a fickle thing. Some days you might get a scrap of something resembling food, other days, nothing. Starvation was a very real threat. And what was this food like? Think gruel, a thin, watery porridge made from whatever grains were available, usually oats or barley. Sometimes it might have a few stray vegetables floating in it, turnips perhaps, or maybe something you couldn't quite identify. Mystery gruel, exciting, right? Meat, a rare treat, reserved for the wealthy or fortunate. And even then, it was often tough, stringy, and questionable in its freshness. Remember, there was no refrigeration. Things went bad quickly, and jailers weren't exactly known for their fastidiousness in sourcing high-quality cuts of meat. Water, essential for life, but in a medieval prison, it was often contaminated, drawn from wells that were close to, less than sanitary areas. Think open sewers, overflowing cesspits. You get the picture. Drinking water could easily lead to dysentery, typhoid, or any number of other nasty waterborne illnesses. So you're hungry, thirsty, and potentially poisoning yourself with every sip. Sounds delightful. Now, let's talk about hygiene, or again, the lack of it. Sanitation was non-existent by modern standards. Most prisons had no dedicated toilet facilities. Prisoners relieved themselves in buckets or in a corner of their cell. These buckets were emptied, eventually, whenever the gaoler got around to it, which might be days or even weeks. The stench must have been overwhelming, a cocktail of human waste, rotting food, and unwashed bodies. Imagine trying to sleep, eat, or simply exist in that environment. Bathing, an unimaginable luxury. Washing was rare, if it happened at all, and with overcrowding being the norm, you were constantly in close proximity to other unwashed individuals, sharing lice, fleas, and other delightful parasites. Clothing, you wore the clothes you were arrested in, and that was it. No changes of clothes, no laundry services. Your clothes became encrusted with dirt, sweat, and other things, providing a perfect breeding ground for disease. Which brings us to the constant threat of illness. Disease was rampant in medieval prisons. Overcrowding, poor sanitation, and malnutrition created the perfect conditions for epidemics to flourish. Typhus, spread by lice, was a common killer. So was dysentery, caused by contaminated food and water. Tuberculosis, a lung disease, thrived in the cramped, poorly ventilated cells. And then there was jail fever, a catch-all term for a variety of infectious diseases that swept through prisons, often wiping out large numbers of inmates. Imagine being sick, weak, and confined to a dark, filthy cell, with no medical care, no medicine, just the gnawing certainty that you were likely going to die, slowly and painfully. Wounds, even minor ones, could easily become infected. Without antibiotics, infections could spread rapidly, leading to sepsis and death. And the worst part, you were surrounded by others who were equally sick, or even worse. The sight, the smell, the sounds of suffering, it must have been a truly horrific experience. Medieval prisons weren't just places of confinement, they were breeding grounds for disease, incubators of suffering, and often, death sentences in themselves. They were places where hope withered and despair flourished. It's a somber thought, but it's a reality worth understanding as we explore the deeper, darker corners of our history. Now, let's find a more peaceful thought as we transition to the next part of our story. Alright, settle in friends, let's dim the lights a bit further and drift into the rather unglamorous world of medieval prison economics. It's probably not what you imagine when you think of dungeons and chains, but someone had to keep the lights on, so to speak, even if those lights were just flickering torches casting long, eerie shadows. The first thing to understand is that medieval prisons weren't exactly state-funded paradises of rehabilitation. Quite the opposite, in fact. The concept of state-funded anything was, well, let's just say it wasn't exactly a priority back then. Most prisons, or gaols as they were often called, operated on a rather, shall we say, entrepreneurial basis. And that brings us to the gaoler. The gaoler, or jailer, was the person in charge. Now, you might picture a stern, imposing figure, perhaps with a cruel glint in their eye, and a penchant for dispensing harsh justice. While some were undoubtedly like that, many were simply trying to make a living in a system that incentivized, well, let's call it creative bookkeeping. You see, jailers were rarely salaried officials. Instead, they were typically granted the right to run the prison as a kind of franchise. They were responsible for everything: the upkeep of the building, the food and drink for the prisoners, and of course their own wages. And how did they manage all this? Through fees. Lots and lots of fees. Imagine arriving at your medieval prison. You've been accused of, let's say, stealing a loaf of bread. Maybe you actually did it. Maybe you didn't. Either way, you're now in the gaoler's custody. The first fee you'd likely encounter was an entrance fee, sometimes charmingly referred to as garnish. This was essentially a bribe to even be allowed into the prison. If you couldn't pay, well, things got unpleasant quickly. Maybe you'd be left outside in the elements. Maybe you'd be thrown into the deepest, darkest, dampest part of the prison, where the rats were particularly friendly. Then there were the daily fees. These covered your upkeep, your food, your bedding, if you were lucky enough to get any, and protection from, well, let's just say, the less savory elements of the prison population. And the catch, the quality of what you got was directly proportional to how much you paid. Pay well, and you might get a somewhat edible meal, a relatively clean straw pallet, and maybe even a guard who was willing to turn a blind eye to the occasional infraction. Pay poorly, and you were looking at starvation rations, sleeping on the bare stone floor, and being fair game for every bully and cutthroat in the place. And of course, there were the exit fees. Yes, even when you were leaving prison, you had to pay the gaoler. This could be a fee for your release papers, a fee for safe passage out of the prison, guaranteeing that you wouldn't be immediately set upon by your fellow inmates, or just a plain old goodbye and good riddance fee. If you couldn't pay this, well, you might find yourself detained a little longer, until someone, a friend, a relative, or perhaps even a sympathetic member of the clergy, could scrape together the necessary funds. Now, you might be thinking, this sounds like a system ripe for abuse, and you'd be absolutely right. The temptation to squeeze every last penny out of the prisoners was immense. Gaolers were notorious for overcharging for everything, selling watered-down ale at exorbitant prices, and pocketing the difference. They might deliberately neglect prisoners, starving them or denying them medical care, in order to save money. And of course, they might be persuaded to release prisoners early, for a suitable consideration, regardless of their crimes. Corruption was rampant. Gaolers could accept bribes from prisoners to provide better treatment, to turn a blind eye to escapes, or even to frame other inmates. They might extort money from the families of prisoners, threatening to harm their loved ones if they didn't pay up. And they might collude with local criminals, using the prison as a base of operations for their illicit activities. After all, who would suspect the gaoler of being involved in a robbery or a murder? The system also created a kind of perverse incentive structure. The more prisoners a gaoler had, the more money they could make. This could lead to gaolers actively seeking out new inmates, perhaps by exaggerating the severity of crimes, or by colluding with corrupt officials to ensure that more people were sent to prison. And of course, it meant that gaolers had little incentive to rehabilitate prisoners. A reformed prisoner was a lost source of income. Now, it's easy to think of this system as just blatant corruption and cruelty, and in many ways it was. But it's also important to remember the context. Medieval society was a very different place from our own. The concept of human rights was, shall we say, still in its early stages of development. People were generally expected to take care of themselves, and the state had a limited role in providing for the welfare of its citizens. The economics of imprisonment in the Middle Ages weren't some dark secret. It was just the way things were. The gaolers weren't necessarily monsters, just people trying to make a living in a system that was designed to be exploited. The system itself was the problem, a system that profited from human misery and incentivized cruelty and corruption. And that, my friends, is a rather sobering thought to drift off to. So close your eyes and try not to dream of dungeons and fees, just peaceful sheep. Count them and let them carry you off to sleep. Alright, let's settle in a little deeper, shall we? Now, medieval prisons weren't exactly known for their hospitality, and sadly, that extended to the methods used to encourage confessions, enforce discipline, and maintain order. If the cold, the damp, and the disease weren't enough, well, let's just say things could get significantly worse. First off, let's talk about confessions. Obtaining a confession was often seen as crucial for a conviction, even if the evidence was flimsy at best. And medieval authorities weren't exactly shy about using persuasion. We're not talking polite requests here. Torture was, unfortunately, a fairly common tool. though its legality and application varied from place to place and depending on who you were. A noble probably wouldn't find themselves on the rack, while a commoner, well, their chances weren't quite as good. One of the most well-known methods was the rack. Imagine being stretched, slowly and painfully, as ropes attached to your limbs are tightened. Joints dislocate, muscles tear, and the pressure builds until something breaks. The rack was designed to inflict maximum pain without necessarily leaving visible marks, at least initially. The goal, of course, was to break the prisoner's will and get them to admit to whatever they were accused of. Then there were the thumbscrews. Small devices, easy to transport, and excruciatingly effective. These little contraptions would slowly crush the thumbs or other digits between iron plates. Again, the pain was intense, and the damage could be permanent, leaving lasting reminders of your time in prison. Another favorite was the strappado. The prisoner would be suspended by their wrists, which were tied behind their back. Weights might be added to their feet, increasing the strain on their shoulders and arms. Dislocation was common, and the pain could be unbearable. Sometimes the prisoner would be repeatedly dropped from a short height to add extra impact. Water torture also made an appearance. There were several variations, but the general idea was to force large amounts of water down the prisoner's throat, causing intense bloating and discomfort, sometimes leading to internal damage. In other versions, water would be dripped continuously onto the forehead, a method designed to drive the victim to madness. And let's not forget sleep deprivation. Keeping a prisoner awake for extended periods was a surprisingly effective form of torture. The lack of sleep would lead to disorientation, hallucinations, and a breakdown of mental resistance, making them far more likely to confess. Now, torture wasn't just about extracting confessions, it was also used as a form of punishment. Flogging or whipping was a common method for disciplining inmates. The severity of the flogging would depend on the offense, but it could range from a few lashes to a brutal beating that left permanent scars. Branding was another popular form of punishment. A hot iron, bearing a specific symbol, would be pressed into the skin, marking the prisoner as a criminal. This mark served as a public shaming and made it difficult for them to escape or reintegrate into society. The pillory and stocks were also used for public humiliation. The prisoner would be placed in these devices, often in a public square, where they would be subjected to ridicule and abuse from passers-by. Sometimes they would be pelted with rotten fruit, vegetables, or even stones. For more serious offenses, punishments could be far more gruesome. Mutilation was not uncommon. Hands might be cut off for theft, tongues removed for blasphemy, or ears lopped off for various offenses. These punishments were designed to be both painful and permanent, serving as a deterrent to others. And of course, there was execution. Methods varied, from hanging and beheading to burning at the stake and drawing and quartering, the latter being reserved for the most serious crimes, like treason. These executions were often public spectacles, designed to inspire fear and obedience. Now, beyond these formalized methods, there was also the everyday brutality of prison life. Guards could be arbitrary and cruel, inflicting punishments on a whim. Inmates themselves could also be brutal, with stronger prisoners often preying on the weaker ones. The conditions within the prisons also contributed to the suffering. Overcrowding, lack of sanitation, and poor ventilation created a breeding ground for disease and violence. Food was scarce and often rotten, and clean water was a luxury. All in all, medieval prisons were places of immense suffering. Torture, punishment, and the harsh conditions of imprisonment combined to create a truly horrific experience. It's a stark reminder of the darker aspects of the medieval period and the brutal realities faced by those who found themselves on the wrong side of the law. It's probably for the best if we don't dwell on it too much. Let's move on to discussing the social hierarchy and how even behind bars people still found ways to divide themselves. Alright, let's settle in and talk about something a bit grim. Even for medieval prisons, the social order, or rather the disorder within those stone walls, You might think everyone in prison was equal in their misery, but human nature unfortunately finds a way to stratify even the most wretched conditions. It's a really tough listen, so get comfy and try not to think about it too much. Imagine being crammed into a dark, damp cell. The air is thick with the stench of unwashed bodies, disease, and despair. Food is scarce and often rotten. You're surrounded by people accused of everything from petty theft to murder, people who are likely desperate and frankly dangerous. Now, in that kind of environment, a power structure will emerge, whether it's officially sanctioned or not. At the bottom, you've got the new arrivals, the weak, the sick, or the simply unlucky. They're immediately vulnerable. They're the targets for exploitation, both physical and economic. Think of it like a really unpleasant high school cafeteria, but with higher stakes. Possessions, meager as they might be, a slightly warmer blanket, a less moldy crust of bread, even just a slightly better spot on the floor to sleep. These become valuable commodities, and they're often taken by force or through coercion. Then there are the prison bullies. These are often the physically strongest inmates, or those with the most violent reputations. They establish dominance through intimidation and brute force. They control access to resources, demand tribute from the weaker inmates, and generally make life a living hell. It's a constant struggle for survival, and for some, preying on others is the only way they know how to cope, or to gain some semblance of control in a completely uncontrollable situation. Now, things get a little more complicated when we talk about trustees. Trustees were inmates who, for various reasons, gained the favor of the gaoler or prison authorities. They might be long-term prisoners who had learned how to navigate the system, or perhaps they had useful skills like literacy or accounting. Maybe they just knew how to brown nose really well, honestly. These trustees were given certain privileges. They might be allowed to move more freely within the prison, oversee other inmates, or even act as messengers or guards. Sometimes they might even be allowed outside the prison walls for short periods. It sounds like a sweet deal, right? A bit of comfort in this awful place. But of course, there was a catch. Trustees were essentially extensions of the prison authority. They were expected to maintain order, report on other inmates, and generally enforce the rules. This put them in a difficult position. On one hand, they had a degree of power and privilege. On the other, they were despised by the other inmates, seen as traitors and collaborators. They were often caught between the demands of the gaoler and the resentment of their fellow prisoners. And you can imagine the abuse of power that came with that situation. Oh boy. Trustees could use their positions to extort other inmates, demanding bribes for protection or for access to better food. They could manipulate the system to their own advantage, framing rivals or getting revenge on those who had wronged them. They were essentially mini-gaolers, wielding authority over the other inmates, and often abusing that authority in the process. The gaolers themselves often turned a blind eye to this kind of exploitation. After all, as we've said before, medieval prisons were often run for profit. If the trustees were keeping order and generating revenue, the gaoler was less likely to interfere, even if it meant that the weaker inmates were being systematically abused. It was a deeply corrupt system, and the inmates were just pawns in a larger game of power and greed. Think about the economics of it too. A trustee might have access to slightly better food rations, or perhaps they were allowed to receive small gifts from visitors. These small advantages gave them leverage over the other inmates. They could trade these goods for favors, for information, or even just for a bit of peace and quiet. It created a kind of internal prison economy, where the trustees held all the cards. And of course, let's not forget the ever-present threat of violence. Prisons were brutal places, and physical assaults were common. Trustees could use their power to protect themselves and their allies from violence, while at the same time turning a blind eye to attacks on those they didn't like, or even orchestrating attacks themselves. The exploitation wasn't just physical, It could also be psychological. Trustees could spread rumors, manipulate alliances, and generally create a climate of fear and paranoia. They could use their knowledge of the prison system to demoralize other inmates, convincing them that there was no hope of escape or release. And it's important to remember that this wasn't just about individual acts of cruelty. It was about a system that allowed and even encouraged exploitation. The gaolers, the trustees, even the other inmates were all complicit in this system, each playing their part in a twisted social order where the strong preyed on the weak, and where justice was a distant memory. The really awful thing about this whole power dynamic is that it mirrored the social inequalities of the world outside the prison walls. The rich and powerful were able to exploit the poor and vulnerable, and this dynamic played out even in the confined space of a medieval prison. It was a microcosm of medieval society, with all its flaws and injustices amplified and concentrated. So when you think about medieval prisons, don't just think about the physical conditions, the damp cells and the rotten food. Think about the human element, the power struggles, the exploitation, the constant struggle for survival. It's a grim picture, I know, but it's an important reminder of the dark side of human nature and the depths of despair that people can sink to when trapped in a system of oppression. We'll take a break after that really tough section. Try to rest easy. Alright, let's settle in and delve into a rather determined aspect of medieval prison life: escapes and uprisings. Because no one really wants to be stuck in those places. Now, escaping from a medieval prison wasn't exactly like gliding through laser beams in a modern spy movie. Think more desperate measures, fueled by sheer will, and often ending rather unpleasantly. The odds were stacked against you from the start. Those walls weren't just there, they were thick, guarded, and often topped with unpleasant things like spikes and boiling oil. The medieval equivalent of do not touch. One of the most straightforward, though incredibly risky, methods was bribery. If you had any coin left, or friends willing to part with theirs, you might be able to persuade a guard to look the other way. Gaolers, you see, were often poorly paid and not always the most ethically sound individuals. A well-placed bribe could secure a key, a loosened shackle, or even just a few minutes of unattended time. Of course, being caught bribing a guard usually resulted in, let's just say, further unpleasantries. Then there's the ever-popular method of simply breaking out. This was a favorite among the more physically inclined prisoners. Think chipping away at walls with whatever implements they could find: spoons, bits of stone, maybe even gnawing at the mortar with their teeth, if they were truly desperate. The problem, of course, was that medieval prisons weren't exactly built with flimsy materials. We're talking stone, iron, and a complete disregard for building codes. This method required immense patience, stamina, and a healthy dose of luck, especially when trying to stay quiet. And what about the classic disguise trick? Finding suitable clothing for a disguise was, shall we say, challenging. You weren't exactly going to find a spare guard uniform hanging around, but desperate people are creative. They would use rags, scraps of cloth, anything they could find to mimic the appearance of a guard, a servant, or even another prisoner being released. The key was confidence and a little bit of bluster. Now, sometimes escape attempts were elaborate. We're talking tunnels dug under walls, ropes fashioned from bedsheets, and coordinated efforts involving multiple prisoners. One particularly fascinating example, although shrouded in legend, involves a group of prisoners who supposedly drugged the guards with a concoction brewed from stolen herbs, and then slipped away into the night under the cover of a conveniently timed thunderstorm. Did it actually happen that way? Maybe not, but it's a good story, isn't it? But escape wasn't just about individual effort. Sometimes prisoners banded together in open rebellion. Conditions inside medieval prisons were, to put it mildly, appalling. Overcrowding, starvation, disease, and the constant threat of violence were enough to push anyone to their breaking point. A prison uprising could start with a minor incident, a dispute over food, a particularly brutal beating, and quickly escalate into a full-blown riot. These uprisings were rarely successful, mind you. Medieval prisons were designed to suppress exactly this kind of thing. But they did happen, and they tell us a lot about the desperation and resilience of the people confined within those walls. The reasons for these revolts were usually quite simple: sheer survival. Inadequate food, rampant disease, abusive guards. These were the common catalysts. Imagine being crammed into a dark, damp cell with dozens of other people, barely enough food to survive, and the constant fear of contracting some horrible illness. It's not a recipe for a happy and quiet existence. Sometimes uprisings were sparked by outside events. A political upheaval, a change in leadership, or even just a rumor of better conditions in another prison could ignite a spark of hope and lead to rebellion. Think of it as the medieval version of a prison reform movement, only with considerably more violence. The consequences of a failed uprising were, of course, dire. Leaders were often brutally punished, sometimes publicly, as a warning to other prisoners. Conditions would become even harsher, and the guards would be even more vigilant. But even in the face of such consequences, prisoners continued to rebel. Because, really, what else did they have to lose? The historical record, sadly, is not overflowing with details about successful escapes or uprisings. The authorities weren't exactly keen on publicizing their failures, but the few accounts that do survive offer a glimpse into the minds of those who dared to defy their confinement. They remind us that even in the darkest of times, the human spirit can still find a way to resist, to fight for freedom, or at least a slightly less miserable existence. It's a testament to the enduring human desire to break free, even when the odds are stacked impossibly high. And with that, yawn, we can move on to other aspects of prison life. Sweet dreams. Alright, let's settle in and talk about a particularly grim aspect of medieval prisons: the experience of women. If the overall conditions were horrific for men, they were exponentially worse for women. It's a difficult topic, and at times disturbing, but vital to understanding the full scope of medieval injustice. Medieval society, as we know, was deeply patriarchal. Women held a subordinate position in nearly every aspect of life, both legally and socially. This inherent inequality played out in devastating ways within the prison system. A woman's vulnerability began the moment she was accused of a crime, and only increased once she was behind bars. Firstly, let's consider the types of crimes women were often accused of. While men were more likely to be imprisoned for violent crimes or political offenses, women were frequently incarcerated for things like petty theft, prostitution, scolding, which, believe it or not, was a crime in some places, or even just being suspected of witchcraft. These charges often reflected societal biases and a desire to control female behavior. It's important to remember that accusations alone could land a woman in prison, regardless of actual guilt. The legal system was often arbitrary, and a woman's word held far less weight than a man's. Once inside, the already dreadful conditions of medieval prisons became an even greater threat to female inmates. Remember those overcrowded cells, rampant disease, and lack of sanitation we've discussed. Imagine navigating that as a woman, often with limited access to even the most basic necessities. But beyond the general squalor, women faced a specific and horrifying danger: sexual assault and exploitation. This is where the power imbalances of medieval society became brutally apparent. Female prisoners were incredibly vulnerable to abuse at the hands of jailers, guards, and even other male inmates. Historians have pieced together evidence of this abuse from court records, personal accounts, and other historical documents. While these sources are often fragmented and incomplete, they paint a disturbing picture. It seems clear that sexual assault was a pervasive problem, and one that was rarely, if ever, punished. Jailers, often poorly paid and lacking oversight, saw female prisoners as easy targets. The very nature of their position granted them unchecked power within the prison walls. Think about it: a woman already stripped of her freedom and dignity, completely at the mercy of someone who held absolute authority over her. Resistance was futile, and reporting the abuse was often impossible. Even if a woman did manage to complain, her word would likely be dismissed, or even punished, especially if her accuser was a figure of authority. The exploitation didn't always stop at sexual assault. Some jailers forced female prisoners into labor, essentially turning them into unpaid servants within the prison. They might be made to clean cells, prepare food, or even perform personal tasks for the jailer and his family. This forced labor was another way to exert control and profit from the vulnerability of female inmates. And what about pregnancy? A pregnant woman in a medieval prison faced unimaginable hardship. Childbirth under such conditions was incredibly dangerous, with little to no medical assistance available. Infant mortality rates were already high, but in a prison environment, they would have been even higher. A child born behind bars faced a bleak future, often destined to live and die within the same walls. Furthermore, the social stigma attached to female prisoners was immense. A woman who had been imprisoned, even for a minor offense, could find herself ostracized from her community. Her reputation would be ruined, making it difficult to find work or even marry. This social stigma made it even harder for women to reintegrate into society after their release, perpetuating a cycle of poverty and vulnerability. It's tempting, perhaps, to think that the church would have offered some protection or solace to female prisoners. After all, religious institutions often played a role in administering justice and providing charity. However, the church's record on women's rights was, to put it mildly, mixed. While some religious figures may have shown compassion, the church's overall teachings often reinforced the idea of female inferiority and the need for female submission. This made it difficult for the church to effectively advocate for the rights of female prisoners. The silence surrounding the experiences of women in medieval prisons is deafening. History, as we know, is often written by the victors, and in this case, the victors were men. The voices of female prisoners were largely silenced, their stories untold. It's only through careful analysis of fragmented records and a critical examination of societal biases that we can begin to understand the horrors they faced. It's a deeply uncomfortable topic, but it's crucial to remember that these women existed, they suffered, and their experiences are a stark reminder of the injustices inherent in medieval society. By acknowledging their suffering, we can gain a more complete and nuanced understanding of the past, and perhaps even learn lessons that are relevant to the present. It's another reminder that history is not always a tale of kings and battles, but also a tapestry woven with the often unheard stories of the most vulnerable. Now, let's take a moment to let that settle, and we'll move on shortly. Alright, let's settle in and think about something a little, well, darker. Not dark as in scary monsters, but dark as in the chilling reality of how power works. Tonight, we're going to talk about political prisoners in the medieval period. Because prisons weren't just for thieves and murderers, oh no, they were also very effective tools for kings, lords, and anyone else with something to protect, or someone to silence. Imagine this: you've publicly criticized the king, maybe suggested he's not the best ruler, or perhaps you supported the wrong claimant to the throne after a particularly messy succession. Maybe you're just annoyingly popular and a bit too good at rallying people around you. In the medieval world, these were all tickets to a lengthy and often permanent stay behind bars. Think of prisons as giant, stone-cold statements. A king imprisoning a rebellious baron wasn't just about removing a threat, it was about sending a clear message to all the other barons: this is what happens if you cross me. Imprisonment became a very public demonstration of power, a way to solidify control and discourage dissent. One of the most famous and most used examples of this is, of course, the Tower of London. We'll delve deeper into royal prisons later, but it's worth mentioning now. It served as a residence for monarchs, yes, but also as a very intimidating prison. Holding high-profile political prisoners within its walls was a constant reminder of the king's authority. People like, well, practically everyone who annoyed the Tudors at some point. But it wasn't just kings. Powerful nobles also maintained their own prisons, often within their castles. These weren't always as elaborate as the Tower of London, but they served the same purpose on a smaller scale, silencing rivals, intimidating vassals, and generally keeping the local power dynamic firmly in their favor. A lord accused of treason, or even just owing too much money to the wrong person, might find themselves in a dark, damp cell beneath the castle keep, forgotten by the world. The impact of political imprisonment on medieval society was profound. It stifled free speech, obviously. Who would dare to speak out against injustice when they knew a dungeon cell awaited them? It also fueled paranoia and distrust. People were constantly watching their backs, wondering who might be listening, who might betray them to the authorities. This created a climate of fear that made it much easier for those in power to maintain control. Now, let's talk about some specific examples, just to make this extra real. Consider the case of William Wallace, the Scottish patriot. After leading a rebellion against English rule, he was eventually captured and, brutally executed. But before that, he was imprisoned in the Tower of London. His imprisonment, even for a relatively short time, was a huge propaganda victory for the English. It showed the world that even the most rebellious of subjects could be brought to heel. And what about Joan of Arc? Accused of heresy and other interesting charges, she was imprisoned by the English and their Burgundian allies. Her imprisonment was in many ways as important as her trial and execution. It delegitimized her cause, undermined her followers' morale, and generally made life easier for the English in occupied France. Of course, this backfired spectacularly in the long run, didn't it? Then there's the case of Boethius, a Roman philosopher who lived in the 6th century. He was imprisoned and eventually executed on charges of treason. While in prison, he wrote The Consolation of Philosophy, a hugely influential work that explores themes of justice, fate, and the nature of good and evil. So even in the depths of a medieval prison, the human spirit and the human intellect could still find a way to shine. But let's not forget, he still died for his beliefs. Political imprisonment wasn't just about silencing individuals, though. It was also about targeting entire groups. Religious minorities, for example, were often imprisoned for their beliefs. We'll talk a lot more about heretics and the Inquisition later, but it's worth noting that imprisonment was a key tool in their arsenal. Holding suspected heretics in prison allowed the authorities to interrogate them, pressure them to recant, and generally discourage others from following their example. And it wasn't always about grand political schemes. Sometimes, imprisonment was used for purely personal vendettas. A powerful lord might imprison a rival simply because he didn't like him, or because he wanted his land. The lack of due process in the medieval legal system made it all too easy to abuse the power of imprisonment. The consequences for the imprisoned were, as you might imagine, pretty dire. We've already discussed the horrific conditions in medieval prisons, the lack of food, the disease, the torture. Add to that the psychological toll of being cut off from the world, of knowing that your fate was entirely in the hands of your enemies, and you can start to imagine the suffering that political prisoners endured. Many died in prison, either from disease, starvation, or simply despair. So the next time you think about medieval prisons, remember that they weren't just places where criminals were locked away. They were also tools of power, used to silence dissent, intimidate rivals, and maintain control. And while the medieval period may be long gone, the use of imprisonment as a political tool, well, that's a story that continues to this day. And that, friends, is something worth remembering. Now let's drift off to something a little more fluffy. Sheep, clouds, whatever works for you. Alright, settle in, because we're about to delve into a particularly heavy chapter of medieval history. Think of it as a slightly more intense lullaby. Tonight we're looking at the Inquisition and its methods of dealing with heresy, specifically its use of imprisonment. Now when we talk about the Inquisition, most people probably think of torture. And yeah, that happened, but imprisonment was actually a much more consistent and perhaps ultimately a more insidious tool. Torture was, in theory, meant to extract confessions or force recantations. Imprisonment, on the other hand, could be used to silence dissent, isolate the accused, and essentially wait for their spirit to break slowly. The Inquisition, you see, wasn't one monolithic entity operating uniformly across Europe. It was a series of tribunals established by the Catholic Church, beginning in the 12th century and continuing in various forms for centuries. The initial impetus was to combat the spread of various heretical movements, particularly in southern France. These groups, like the Cathars, challenged fundamental doctrines of the Church, and the Church, naturally, felt it had to respond. So how did imprisonment fit into all of this? Well, once someone was accused of heresy, and that accusation could come from anyone, even anonymous sources, they could be arrested and detained. Unlike the relatively straightforward crimes we discussed in earlier segments, heresy was a slippery thing to define. It could encompass anything from holding slightly different theological beliefs to criticizing the clergy, or even just possessing books deemed unacceptable. The conditions in these inquisitorial prisons, needless to say, weren't exactly comfortable. In fact, they were often far worse than even the average medieval prison. Remember those town gals we talked about? Well, imagine that, but with added psychological pressure. These weren't just places of physical confinement, they were places of spiritual isolation. The Inquisition often used monasteries or converted secular buildings as prisons. These spaces were typically designed for religious contemplation and penance, not punishment, but the distinction blurred very quickly. Cells were often small, dark, and damp. Imagine spending months, even years, in almost complete darkness with limited contact with the outside world. The goal was to create an atmosphere of despair and repentance. Food was, of course, sparse and often deliberately unappetizing. The idea was to encourage humility and self-reflection, but the reality was malnutrition and weakness. Medical care was practically non-existent, illnesses went untreated, and the risk of infection was constant. But perhaps the most devastating aspect of inquisitorial imprisonment was the uncertainty. The accused often didn't know the specific charges against them, or who had accused them. Imagine being locked away, not knowing why you were there, how long you would be there, or what your ultimate fate would be. It was a system designed to induce paranoia and fear. This uncertainty was a deliberate tactic. The Inquisition wanted to break the will of the accused, to make them question their own beliefs, to make them doubt their own sanity. It was a form of psychological torture that could be just as effective, perhaps even more so, than physical pain. Of course, physical torture was still an option, but it wasn't the primary focus of imprisonment. The goal was to create an environment that would lead to self-incrimination. The Inquisition wanted the accused to confess, to renounce their heretical beliefs, and to return to the fold. And what happened after a confession? Well, it depended. Some were sentenced to public penance, forced to wear humiliating garments or perform acts of atonement. Others were sentenced to further imprisonment, perhaps for life. And in some cases, those deemed unrepentant were handed over to the secular authorities for execution. The Inquisition's use of imprisonment wasn't just about punishment, it was about control. It was about maintaining religious orthodoxy and suppressing any challenge to the Church's authority. It was a system that relied on fear, intimidation, and the slow erosion of the human spirit. It's a grim chapter, I know, but it's important to understand how imprisonment was used, not just as a means of physical confinement, but as a tool of spiritual and intellectual oppression. Sleep tight, if you can. Alright, settle in, because we're about to delve into a rather sad chapter of medieval life, imprisonment for debt. Now, in our modern world, we have bankruptcy laws, consumer protection agencies, and various ways to manage financial hardship. But imagine a time with none of that. A time when owing money could literally cost you your freedom. Debtors' prisons weren't purpose-built structures, understand. They were usually just sections within existing gaols, town halls, or even private homes converted into holding cells. The distinction between someone accused of a violent crime and someone who simply couldn't pay their bills was often blurred. You were simply locked up. Now, who exactly ended up in these debtor sections? Well, picture tradesmen, merchants fallen on hard times, farmers facing crop failure, or even widows struggling to manage their deceased husband's affairs. Anyone really who couldn't meet their financial obligations could find themselves behind bars. Think about it. A sudden illness wipes out a family's savings, a series of bad harvests leads to mounting debt, or a business venture sours unexpectedly. In those days, there wasn't much of a safety net. If you defaulted on a loan, the creditor had the right to petition the court for your imprisonment. And these weren't always large, faceless corporations you were dealing with. Often, it was a local merchant, a fellow craftsman, or even a neighbor. Personal relationships and local grudges played a huge role in who ended up inside. The rationale behind imprisoning debtors was, shall we say, interesting. The prevailing logic was that putting someone in jail would encourage them or their families to find the funds to settle the debt. It was seen as a form of pressure, a way to extract payment where other methods had failed. There was also the belief that imprisonment would prevent debtors from running away or hiding their assets. But the reality, of course, was far more bleak. How exactly was someone supposed to earn money to pay off their debt while languishing in a dark, damp cell? It was a deeply flawed system, perpetuating a vicious cycle of poverty and despair. Life in a debtor's section was, predictably, grim. The conditions were often even worse than in the criminal sections, if that's even imaginable. Debtors typically had to pay for their own upkeep, food, bedding, even basic sanitation if it existed. And if you couldn't pay, well, you starved, you slept on the cold floor, you suffered. Many debtors relied on the charity of friends, family, or even compassionate strangers to survive. Begging at the prison gates was a common sight. Some were fortunate enough to have family members willing to work tirelessly to raise the money for their release. But many were simply forgotten, left to rot away in jail, their debts mounting with each passing day. The social implications of this practice were devastating. Families were torn apart, livelihoods ruined, and communities fractured. Imprisonment for debt created a class of people permanently marked by financial failure, often unable to reintegrate into society even after their release. The stigma of being a jailbird clung to them, making it difficult to find work or rebuild their lives. This system also fueled corruption and abuse. Jailers, who were often poorly paid or even unpaid, saw debtors as a source of income. They would charge exorbitant fees for basic necessities, extort money for better treatment, and even collude with creditors to prolong imprisonment. The longer a debtor remained in jail, the more money the jailer could squeeze out of them or their families. And here's a particularly cruel twist. Even after serving their time, debtors weren't necessarily free. If the debt remained unpaid, they could be rearrested and imprisoned again. It was a sentence that could, in effect, last a lifetime. Now you might be wondering, did anyone speak out against this system? Well, yes, gradually. There were growing concerns about the morality and practicality of imprisoning people for debt, particularly among religious and charitable organizations. Some argued that it was a cruel and ineffective way to address financial hardship, while others pointed out the social and economic costs of keeping people locked up. However, reform was slow and piecemeal. It took centuries for imprisonment for debt to be fully abolished in most European countries and the United States. Even then, the legacy of this practice continues to shape our attitudes towards debt and financial responsibility. So as you drift off to sleep tonight, consider the plight of those medieval debtors trapped in a system that offered little hope and even less compassion. Imagine the despair of being imprisoned not for a crime, but for failing to meet your financial obligations, and be grateful for the protections and safety nets that we have in place today, however imperfect they may be. It's a stark reminder of how far we've come, and how important it is to ensure that justice is tempered with mercy. Alright, settle in, because now we're venturing into a world of kings, queens, and not so comfortable accommodations. We're talking about royal prisons, the kind that held the most important, or perhaps troublesome, figures of the medieval world. Think beyond the grimy dungeon, although those were certainly a factor, and into the realm of strategic imprisonment. And when you think of royal prisons, one name probably springs to mind: the Tower of London. It's practically synonymous with imprisonment, isn't it? More than just a fortress, more than just a palace at times, the tower served as a rather exclusive resort for those who had fallen out of favor with the crown. The tower's history as a prison stretches way back, and it's fascinatingly gruesome. Originally built by William the Conqueror, it wasn't initially intended as a prison. It was a statement of power, a defensive stronghold, a royal residence. But thick stone walls, limited access points, it was just too tempting not to use it to lock people up. So who exactly got to experience the charm of the Tower of London? Well, all sorts of high-profile individuals. Political prisoners were a common fixture, of course. Anyone who dared to challenge the king's authority, or even just looked at him funny, might find themselves spending a few years behind those imposing walls. Think of figures like, Queen Elizabeth I herself, before she became queen. During the reign of her sister Mary I, Elizabeth was suspected of plotting against the throne. She was imprisoned in the tower, understandably terrified that she might meet the same fate as many others who had entered those gates. Imagine being a future queen in the dungeons. A real rough night. And then there was Anne Boleyn, one of Henry VIII's wives. Her story is a classic, isn't it? She went from queen to prisoner in a heartbeat, accused of treason and adultery, charges that were likely trumped up. She was beheaded within the tower grounds. It's a chilling reminder of just how precarious life could be at the royal court. But it wasn't just political rivals and disgraced spouses who ended up in the tower. Sometimes it was just plain bad luck. High-ranking nobles who made a strategic error, or got caught on the wrong side of a power struggle, could easily find themselves stripped of their titles and locked away. Of course, the tower wasn't exactly a comfortable place to live. Conditions varied depending on your status. A high-ranking prisoner might get a relatively decent chamber, perhaps with a servant or two, but even then you were still confined. Your freedom was gone. And the constant fear of execution, that couldn't have been conducive to a good night's sleep. Now, the Tower of London is probably the best-known royal prison, but it wasn't the only one. Across medieval Europe, royal castles and fortresses often doubled as places of confinement. For example, consider the Château de Locas in France. This imposing castle served as a prison for centuries, holding figures like Ludovico Sforza, the Duke of Milan. He was imprisoned there after being captured during the Italian Wars. He spent years in a small, cramped cell, eventually going mad. It's a grim tale, but it highlights the psychological toll that imprisonment could take. Or think about the Wartburg Castle in Germany. While not primarily a prison, it famously served as a refuge and a form of confinement for Martin Luther. After being declared an outlaw, Luther was hidden away in the Wartburg, where he translated the Bible into German. So while he wasn't exactly being punished, he was certainly restricted in his movements, and his freedom was severely curtailed. In the end, perhaps this isolation was a gift. He did need to finish his homework after all. These royal prisons, whether they were grand fortresses or smaller, more isolated castles, played a crucial role in maintaining royal power. They allowed monarchs to silence their enemies, to control dissent, and to project an image of strength and authority. But they also serve as a stark reminder of the arbitrary nature of power in the medieval world. One minute you could be a trusted advisor, a beloved spouse, a powerful noble. The next, you could be locked away in a dark cell, your fate entirely in the hands of the king. And that, my friends, is a thought that might just keep you awake tonight, but hopefully in a fascinating, history-filled kind of way. Okay, so prison labor in the medieval period, it's a bit of a complex topic. On the one hand, you've got the, shall we say, very practical concern of just trying to keep prisons afloat. Running these places wasn't exactly cheap, and the idea of prisoners contributing to their own upkeep probably seemed like a no-brainer to a lot of people back then. But then you also have this very nascent idea of rehabilitation. Now, don't get too excited, we're not talking about crafting circles and conflict resolution workshops here, but the thought that maybe, just maybe, forcing prisoners to work could in some way improve them morally or teach them a useful skill was definitely floating around in some circles. Let's start with the practicalities. Medieval prisons, as we've touched on, were often privately run. The gaoler, the guy in charge, was basically a small business owner. He got paid a fee for keeping the prisoners, but that fee often wasn't enough to cover all the expenses. So how did he make up the difference? Well, one way was to get the prisoners to work. What kind of work? It really depended on the location and the skills of the prisoners themselves. In urban gaols, prisoners might be put to work cleaning the streets, repairing roads, or even doing construction work. Sometimes they'd be hired out to local businesses for specific tasks. Think of it as a very involuntary temp agency. In rural areas, prisoners might be assigned to agricultural labor, working in the fields or tending livestock. This was especially common on church-run prisons, where the monks might need extra hands to help with the harvest. And then, of course, there was the really unpleasant stuff. Some prisoners were forced to do the dirtiest, most dangerous jobs imaginable, like cleaning latrines or working in mines. This was particularly true for those considered to be the lowest of the low, the real troublemakers, or those convicted of particularly heinous crimes. Now, was this exploitation? Almost certainly, yes. Prisoners were rarely paid fairly, if at all, and they had no say in the kind of work they were doing. The gaolers were often making a tidy profit off their labor, and the prisoners themselves were seeing little to no benefit. But here's where it gets a little bit more interesting. The idea of rehabilitation, however limited, did start to creep into the conversation. Some religious thinkers, in particular, argued that forcing prisoners to work could be a form of penance, a way to atone for their sins. The logic went something like this: if you made a prisoner work hard and deny them any kind of luxury, they might have some time to reflect on their misdeeds and, repent. Hard work could build character, instill discipline, and maybe even make them less likely to commit crimes in the future. Of course, this was all very theoretical. In reality, the conditions in most medieval prisons were so awful that it's hard to imagine anyone actually experiencing a moral transformation. The lack of food, sanitation, and basic human decency probably did more to break people's spirits than to reform them. And let's be honest, a lot of the time the rehabilitative aspect was just a convenient excuse to justify the exploitation of prisoners. It was a way for the gaolers to feel a little bit better about making a profit off the misery of others. Oh, I'm not just exploiting them, they might have said to themselves, I'm helping them to become better people. Right. There were a few very rare instances where prison labor might have actually had some beneficial effects. If a prisoner was taught a useful trade, like carpentry or blacksmithing, they might have been able to use that skill to earn an honest living after their release. But these cases were few and far between. More often than not, prison labor just reinforced the cycle of poverty and crime. Prisoners were released with no money, no prospects, and a criminal record. What else were they supposed to do but go back to their old ways? So to sum it up, prison labor in the medieval period was a complex mix of practical economics, blatant exploitation, and a very thin veneer of rehabilitative theory. It was a system that was driven more by necessity and greed than by any real desire to help prisoners turn their lives around. And while the idea of rehabilitation might have been nice in theory, the reality was usually far, far grimmer. We're left with this sort of lingering tension. between the ideal of a prisoner made better through labor and the far more common reality of folks simply being further ground down by it all. It's heavy, isn't it? Alright, settle in, friends. Let's gently unravel the knotty subject of law and imprisonment in the medieval period. Think of it like counting sheep, but instead of fluffy wool, we're sorting through dusty legal scrolls, or rather the absence of them. One of the things you'll quickly realize about the medieval world is that due processes wasn't exactly the catchphrase of the day. Today we're pretty accustomed to the idea that you can't just chuck someone in jail without a trial, or some sort of established legal proceedings. But back then, well, things were a little more flexible. Okay, a lot more flexible. More like non-existent in many cases. The concept of standardized legal procedures, as we understand them, was embryonic at best. Laws varied wildly from kingdom to kingdom, duchy to duchy, even village to village, so you may not even know what law you were violating. What was perfectly acceptable in one area could land you in a dungeon in the next. And even if the law was written down, and that was a big if, understanding it often depended on who was interpreting it. Think about it. Who was making these laws anyway? Mostly, it was the local lord, the king, or, in some cases, the church. And guess who was also enforcing those laws? Yep, the same people. So a bit of a conflict of interest, wouldn't you say? This meant that imprisonment could be a pretty arbitrary affair. Maybe you'd offended the Lord somehow. Maybe someone accused you of something, true or false. Maybe the Lord just needed some extra manpower for his castle renovations. Whatever the reason, if someone with power decided you were going to jail, well, you were probably going to jail. There wasn't really an independent judiciary to appeal to, no legal aid societies to give you advice, no Miranda rights to protect you. Your fate often rested entirely on the whim of the person in charge. If they were feeling generous, you might get a fair hearing. If they were having a bad hair day, not so much. And what about evidence? Well, let's just say the standards were different. Hearsay was perfectly acceptable. Torture was a common way of extracting confessions, which of course meant that people would confess to just about anything to make the pain stop. Trials by ordeal were also popular. Things like holding a red-hot iron or being thrown into a lake. If you survived, you were innocent. Makes you appreciate our modern court system, doesn't it? Now, it's important to remember that not everyone was treated equally under this system. If you were a noble, you likely had more rights and privileges than a peasant. You might be imprisoned in a slightly less horrible part of the castle, and you were more likely to get a trial, although of course the outcome of that trial was still heavily influenced by your social standing. The church also had its own legal system, which often overlapped with secular law. If you were accused of heresy or some other religious offense, you might find yourself in an ecclesiastical prison. These prisons weren't necessarily any nicer than secular ones, and the trials could be just as arbitrary. So what were the consequences of this lack of due process? Well, for starters, it meant that a lot of innocent people probably ended up behind bars. It also meant that the system was wide open to abuse. Lords could use imprisonment to silence their enemies, settle scores, or extract wealth from their subjects through ransoms. Corruption was rampant, and justice was often a commodity that could be bought and sold. And it wasn't just the powerful who could abuse the system. Gaolers, the people in charge of the prisons, often ran their facilities like personal fiefdoms. They could charge prisoners exorbitant fees for food, bedding, and even just for not being tortured. If you couldn't pay, well, your life in prison would be even more miserable than it already was, which, trust me, was saying something. The absence of standardized procedures also made it incredibly difficult to challenge imprisonment. There was no clear process for appealing a sentence or demanding a fair trial. If you were in jail, you were pretty much at the mercy of whoever put you there. Now, to be fair, it's easy for us to look back at the medieval period and criticize their legal system, but we should also remember that they were operating in a very different world than ours. They didn't have the same concepts of individual rights and freedoms that we do today. They were more concerned with maintaining order and upholding the authority of the ruling class. That doesn't excuse the injustices that occurred, but it does help us understand them. But even within that context, there were some voices who recognized the problems with the system. Some legal scholars and theologians argued for fairer trials and more humane treatment of prisoners. Some rulers even attempted to reform the legal system, although their efforts were often limited by the power of vested interests. Ultimately, the lack of due process in medieval prisons reflected the broader inequalities and power structures of medieval society. Imprisonment was a tool used by the powerful to control the masses, silence dissent, and maintain their dominance. It was a brutal and often arbitrary system, where justice was often a distant dream. So next time you're watching a movie about medieval knights and castles, remember that the reality was a lot less romantic than the movies portray, and that includes the legal system, or rather, the lack thereof. It's a reminder of how far we've come in terms of protecting individual rights and ensuring fair treatment under the law, even if we still have a long way to go. Now, time for some sleep, friends. Good night. Alright, let's settle in and consider what folks back in the medieval period actually thought about prisons. It's easy to impose our modern sensibilities, isn't it? But they lived in a different world with different fears, different priorities. So what did the average medieval person really think when they heard about someone locked up? Well, first off, there's the simple primal fear. Prisons weren't exactly advertised as holiday resorts, were they? They were, for the most part, truly awful places. Dark, damp, disease-ridden, the stuff of nightmares. Just knowing such places existed would inspire a sense of dread. Imagine a peasant hearing tales of the dungeons in a lord's castle, whispered stories of torture, starvation, and madness. These weren't just cautionary tales, they reflected a genuine fear of arbitrary power and the very real possibility of ending up in such a place yourself. And fear wasn't just about the place itself, but also about the people inside. Medieval society had a very strong sense of communal responsibility, but also a deep suspicion of outsiders and those who broke the law. A prisoner was almost by definition a danger to the community. They were a source of disruption, a threat to the established order. Even if someone was imprisoned for a relatively minor crime, there was a sense that they were fundamentally untrustworthy, that they had somehow violated the social contract. That fear could easily translate into prejudice and a desire for harsh punishment. But then there's the flip side of that fear, a morbid curiosity, human nature, right? We're drawn to the macabre, the forbidden. Think about the Tower of London, for example. Even then it was a site of fascination, wasn't it? People were drawn to it, wanting to catch a glimpse of the infamous prisoners held within its walls. They'd probably linger near the gates, hoping to overhear some scrap of information, some juicy rumor about the goings-on inside. It's like our modern fascination with true crime, but with a medieval twist. This curiosity wasn't always idle. Sometimes it was mixed with a sense of justice, or a desire to see that wrongs were righted. People wanted to know why someone was imprisoned, what they had done to deserve such a fate. This information, though often filtered through rumor and speculation, helped to solidify their understanding of right and wrong, of what was acceptable behavior and what wasn't. Public executions, of course, were the ultimate expression of this, a very public display of justice being served, a warning to others, and a source of grim fascination for the crowds that gathered. And that brings us to the moral judgments. Medieval society was deeply religious, and that religious framework heavily influenced how they viewed crime and punishment. Sin wasn't just a personal failing, it was an offense against God and the entire community. Imprisonment, therefore, could be seen as a form of divine retribution, a way for God to punish the wicked. It was also a chance for the prisoner to repent, to atone for their sins and seek forgiveness. This emphasis on repentance explains, in part, the Church's involvement in the prison system. Monasteries, for example, often served as places of confinement, not just for monks who had broken their vows, but also for lay people convicted of certain crimes. The idea was that the disciplined environment and religious instruction would help them to reform their ways. It's a very different concept from our modern ideas of rehabilitation, but the underlying principle that prisons should do more than just punish was certainly present. Of course, moral judgments weren't always charitable. Medieval society had a very clear sense of social hierarchy, and that influenced how people were judged. A noble imprisoned for treason would be viewed very differently from a peasant imprisoned for theft. The noble might be seen as a tragic figure, a victim of circumstance or political intrigue. The peasant, on the other hand, might be dismissed as simply a common criminal, deserving of whatever punishment they received. Social status played a huge role in shaping public perception, and it's easy to imagine those prejudices influencing judgments when people discussed those behind bars. Furthermore, the specific crime also mattered a great deal. Religious offenses like heresy or blasphemy were often viewed with particular horror. These weren't just crimes against society, they were seen as a direct threat to the spiritual well-being of the entire community. Similarly, crimes against authority, like treason or rebellion, were regarded with extreme severity. These were seen as attacks on the very foundations of the social order, and were met with swift and brutal punishment. Think about the stories that would circulate, the ballads sung in taverns, the sermons preached in churches. These were powerful tools for shaping public opinion, for reinforcing moral values, and for demonizing those who transgressed. A catchy tune about a highwayman might romanticize his exploits, but it would also emphasize the dangers of a life outside the law. A fiery sermon about the evils of heresy would instill fear and suspicion of anyone who questioned religious orthodoxy. In essence, medieval prisons existed not just as places of confinement, but also as symbols of social control. They represented the power of the authorities to punish wrongdoing, to maintain order, and to reinforce the prevailing moral code. Public perceptions of prisons were shaped by a complex mix of fear, curiosity, and moral judgments, all filtered through the lens of a deeply religious and hierarchical society. It's important to realize these perceptions were fluid, changing with context, personal belief, and the particular individual who found themselves locked away. All right, let's settle in, shall we? Tonight we're tracing a shift, a subtle but significant one, in the way medieval prisons were managed. We're talking about the decline of private prisons and the gradual rise of state control, particularly in the late medieval period. Now I know, prisons aren't exactly the most cheerful topic, but stick with me. This shift reflects some pretty important changes happening in medieval society as a whole. Up until this point, you see, the business of incarceration was often a private affair. Think about it. A lord owns a castle, right? He needs somewhere to lock up troublemakers, tax dodgers, maybe a rival he doesn't quite trust. He uses his dungeon. A town has a jail. It's often run by a jailer who's essentially renting the space from the town council and making his living off the prisoners. So what does this mean? Well, for one thing, it means that profit was often a prime motivator. Gaolers charged prisoners for, well, everything. For a better cell, for food that wasn't completely rotten, for not being put in the stocks. It was a system ripe for abuse, and believe me, abuse was plentiful. But as the late medieval period rolls around, we're talking roughly the 14th and 15th centuries, things start to change. Slowly, yes, very slowly. But they change nonetheless. Centralized power is growing. Kings are becoming more powerful. Royal courts are becoming more established. And with that comes a growing sense that justice, and therefore imprisonment, is something that should be managed by the state, by the crown, not left to the whims of individual lords or profit-hungry gaolers. Now, this isn't a sudden dramatic takeover, mind you. It's not like one day the king sends out a decree and suddenly every dungeon is run by a royal official. No, it's much more gradual than that. It's a process of creeping control of the crown crown slowly asserting its authority over the administration of justice. One way they did this was through legislation. Kings started passing laws that regulated prisons, setting standards for their operation, and limiting the powers of private gaolers. For example, a law might be passed dictating the minimum amount of food a prisoner was entitled to, or prohibiting certain forms of torture. Of course, enforcing these laws was another matter entirely, but the fact that they were being passed at all shows a shift in thinking. Another key factor was the establishment of royal prisons. Think of places like the Tower of London, for example. These weren't just prisons, they were symbols of royal power, and they were directly controlled by the crown. They housed not just common criminals but also political prisoners, high-ranking nobles who had fallen out of favor, and anyone who posed a threat to the king's authority. By building and maintaining these royal prisons, the crown was sending a clear message that it was the ultimate authority in matters of justice. The 100 Years' War, raging across much of this period, also played a role. War requires strong central governance, and to wage it effectively, monarchs needed revenue and control. That meant limiting the powers of regional nobles, consolidating law enforcement, and finding funds to fight. One way monarchs could achieve this control was by reasserting their jurisdiction over prisons, thus siphoning off some of the jailers' profits to the crown through centralized control. Furthermore, the growing complexity of the legal system also contributed to the shift. As laws became more sophisticated, and as the role of lawyers and judges became more formalized, there was a growing need for a more standardized system of imprisonment. Private prisons, with their varying conditions and often arbitrary treatment of prisoners, simply weren't up to the task. Now, it's important to remember that this shift towards state control wasn't necessarily motivated by humanitarian concerns. It wasn't like kings suddenly developed a deep concern for the welfare of prisoners. No, it was primarily about power and control. The crown wanted to assert its authority, to consolidate its power, and to ensure that justice was administered in a way that served its interests. And even as state control grew, private prisons didn't disappear entirely. They continued to exist, often operating alongside royal prisons, but their power and influence were gradually diminished. There were still private prisons in towns and large estates for a while, but standards were starting to be imposed. The shift to state control also led to some changes in the way prisons were run. Royal prisons were often better funded and better maintained than private prisons. There was a greater emphasis on security, and there was a greater effort to keep prisoners alive, at least until their trial. After all, a dead prisoner couldn't be punished, and the crown wanted to make sure that justice was seen to be done. However, let's not get carried away. Life in even the best-run royal prison was still pretty grim. Overcrowding was rampant, disease was rife, and conditions were still unsanitary. Torture was still used, although perhaps with a bit more discretion than in the past. And of course, the social hierarchy within prisons remained in place. Wealthy prisoners still enjoyed better treatment than poor prisoners, and those with connections could still pull strings to improve their lot. So the shift from private to state control was a gradual, complex process that was driven primarily by the crown's desire to consolidate its power and assert its authority. It wasn't necessarily motivated by humanitarian concerns, and it didn't lead to any dramatic improvements in prison conditions. But it did represent a significant change in the way prisons were managed, and it laid the groundwork for the development of more modern penal systems in the centuries that followed. And if you have trouble falling asleep, just picture the damp, dark walls, the rattling chains, and the unwavering tick-tock of fate counting down the minutes in some dungeon, and drift off into slumberland. There you go. Alright, settling in for another chapter? Good. Tonight we're moving away from the rather grim realities of medieval prisons, and focusing on something a bit more hopeful. We're going to talk about the first whispers of change, the nascent reform movements that dared to question the status quo. It's a slow shift, mind you, but every journey starts with a single step, right? Now, it's important to remember that the concept of prison reform as we understand it today, rehabilitation, humane treatment, and reintegration into society, well, that was a long way off. The medieval mindset was primarily focused on punishment, retribution, and deterring others from committing crimes. However, even in this environment, cracks began to appear in the wall of acceptance. One of the earliest drivers of change, perhaps unsurprisingly, came from within the church. Remember, the church held significant power in medieval society, not just spiritually, but also legally and politically. Figures within the clergy, exposed to the harsh realities of ecclesiastical prisons and the general treatment of prisoners, began to voice concerns. These weren't radical calls for abolishing imprisonment, mind you, more like gentle suggestions for improvements. Think of it as softening the edges. The emphasis was often on spiritual reform, encouraging prisoners to repent for their sins and find redemption through prayer and reflection. Some monastic orders, for example, started providing basic necessities to prisoners, such as food, clothing, and medical care, even if it was rudimentary. This wasn't always altruistic, of course. It was also a way for the church to demonstrate its power and influence, and to ensure the prisoners remained within the fold, so to speak. But these actions did set a precedent. They acknowledged, in a small way, that prisoners were still human beings, deserving of at least some level of care. It was a tiny spark of humanity in a very dark place. Beyond the church, there were also secular voices advocating for change, though they were often fewer in number and faced greater resistance. These individuals were typically motivated by a sense of injustice, a belief that the current system was inherently unfair. One of the key issues they focused on was the arbitrary nature of imprisonment. Remember how we talked about jailers profiting from prisoners? This created a system where people could be imprisoned for minor offenses, or even simply for failing to pay debts, and their release often depended on their ability to pay the gaoler's fees. This meant the wealthy could often buy their way out, while the poor languished in prison, regardless of their guilt or innocence. Thinkers and legal scholars began to question the fairness of this system. They argued that justice should be blind, that the punishment should fit the crime, and that imprisonment shouldn't be used as a tool for personal enrichment. Now, actually implementing these ideas, that was the tricky part. Remember, medieval society was deeply hierarchical. The nobility and the wealthy held most of the power, and they weren't always keen on reforms that might threaten their privileges. Any attempt to challenge the status quo often met with resistance, sometimes even violence. One of the main obstacles was the lack of standardized laws and procedures. The legal system was often fragmented, with different regions and towns having their own customs and practices. This made it difficult to establish clear guidelines for imprisonment and to prevent abuse. Another challenge was the simple lack of resources. Building and maintaining prisons was expensive, and most medieval governments were already struggling to fund other essential services, like defense and infrastructure. Improving prison conditions often took a back seat to more pressing concerns. Despite these obstacles, the early reform movements did achieve some modest successes. In some areas, laws were passed to limit the power of gaolers and to prevent them from exploiting prisoners. Efforts were made to improve the sanitation of prisons and to provide better food and medical care. And perhaps most importantly, the idea that prisoners deserved some level of humane treatment started to gain traction, slowly but surely. It's important to note that these weren't widespread reforms. They were often localized and sporadic, and their impact was limited, but they did represent a shift in thinking, a recognition that the current system wasn't working and that something needed to change. These early reformers laid the groundwork for future generations of activists who would continue to fight for prison reform. They planted the seeds of change, even if they didn't get to see the harvest. So who were some of these voices, these early pioneers of prison reform? Well, unfortunately, many of their names have been lost to history. The medieval world didn't always prioritize recording the actions of those who challenged the status quo, especially if they weren't nobility. There are a few figures who stand out. Consider the role of certain religious orders. The Franciscans, for instance, were known for their work with the poor and marginalized, and they often visited prisons, providing comfort and assistance to inmates. While they didn't necessarily advocate for radical reforms, their actions did raise awareness about the plight of prisoners and help to humanize them in the eyes of the public. Then you had individual legal scholars and thinkers who challenged the prevailing attitudes toward punishment and imprisonment. While their writings didn't always translate into immediate action, they did contribute to a growing body of knowledge about crime and justice, laying the foundation for future reforms. Think of these early reformers as tiny candles flickering in the darkness. They might not have been able to illuminate the entire prison system, but their light did shine through, providing a glimmer of hope and inspiring others to take action. It's important to remember, these efforts weren't about coddling criminals or undermining the legal system. They were about ensuring that justice was fair, that prisoners were treated with basic human dignity, and that the punishment served a purpose beyond mere retribution. And in a way, that's a message that still resonates today, isn't it? The pursuit of justice is an ongoing process, a constant striving for a more fair and equitable society. And even in the darkest of times, there are always voices of change, whispering in the wind, pushing us toward a better future. So as you drift off to sleep tonight, remember those early reformers, those tiny candles in the darkness. They might not have changed the world overnight, but they did start a journey toward a more humane and just society. And that, my friend, is something worth dreaming about. Alright, let's settle in for a few stories that really put a human face on this whole medieval prison thing. We've talked about the structures, the laws, the conditions, but what about the people who actually lived, or more accurately, existed, within those walls? First, let's think about a woman named Agnes. Agnes was a wool merchant's wife in 14th century England, seemingly unremarkable, right? Well, Agnes found herself on the wrong side of a local dispute. A neighbor accused her of slander, claiming Agnes had spread malicious rumors that damaged his business and reputation. Now, in a time when reputation was everything, slander was a serious charge. The details are a little murky in the surviving records, but it seems the neighbor, a rather influential fellow, had a good deal more weight behind him when they went before the local magistrate. Agnes, despite her pleas of innocence, was found guilty. Her sentence: imprisonment in the town jail. Now, Agnes wasn't thrown into some deep, dark dungeon, at least not initially. Town jails, as we've discussed, were often located in gatehouses or other public buildings. But that didn't mean her experience was pleasant. The jail was overcrowded, damp, and reeked of human waste. Food was scarce and of poor quality. Agnes, used to a comfortable life, suffered terribly from the conditions. Her husband Thomas tried to secure her release, petitioning the magistrate and even attempting to bribe the gaoler, a common practice, though often unsuccessful. He visited her as often as he was allowed, bringing what little extra food and comforts he could afford. But Thomas was only a middling merchant himself. He had to keep his business running, and the expenses of Agnes's imprisonment, jailer's fees, legal costs, strained his finances. Weeks turned into months. Agnes' health deteriorated. She contracted a fever, likely from the unsanitary conditions. Thomas, desperate, redoubled his efforts to secure her release, but to no avail. Agnes died in the jail, a victim of both the slander charge and the brutal realities of medieval imprisonment. Her story highlights the vulnerability of ordinary people to the whims of local justice and the precariousness of life in a time when imprisonment often meant a death sentence. Now let's move on to a very different case, that of Geoffrey, a minor nobleman accused of treason in France during the 100 Years' War. Geoffrey's story illustrates how prisons were used as political tools. Geoffrey was suspected of plotting against the French crown, potentially collaborating with the English. Whether these accusations were true or based on the political machinations of his rivals is lost to history, really. What we do know is that Geoffrey was arrested and imprisoned in a royal castle, a far more secure and imposing prison than any town jail. His imprisonment was not just about punishment, it was about silencing a potential threat to the king's authority. Geoffrey's experience was one of relative privilege compared to Agnes. As a nobleman, he was afforded better conditions than commoners. He had his own cell, which, while still cold and damp, was at least private. He received better food, though hardly a feast, and he was allowed visitors, albeit under strict supervision. However, Geoffrey faced a different kind of hardship, the constant threat of torture. He was repeatedly interrogated, pressured to confess to treason, and reveal the names of any co-conspirators. While we don't have explicit accounts of Geoffrey being tortured, the possibility hung over him like a sword. After several years of imprisonment, Geoffrey's fate took an unexpected turn. A truce was declared between England and France. As part of the peace negotiations, a general amnesty was offered, including the release of political prisoners. Geoffrey, though never formally cleared of the treason charges, was freed. His imprisonment was a political calculation, and his release was another. Geoffrey's story shows how medieval prisons were used to control political rivals and maintain power. His relatively privileged treatment highlights the social hierarchy that permeated even prison walls, but also underscores the ever-present threat of brutal interrogation and the precariousness of political fortunes. Finally, let's consider the case of Brother Thomas, a Benedictine monk accused of heresy in 13th century Italy. Thomas was a scholar and theologian who began to question some of the Church's doctrines. His views, considered unorthodox, attracted the attention of the local bishop. He was accused of heresy, a grave offense in the medieval world. Thomas was imprisoned in a monastic prison, a space designed for penance and reflection, but also for strict control. His cell was small and bare, with only a straw pallet for a bed and a small window high up in the wall. His days were spent in prayer, contemplation, and some accounts suggest occasional periods of self-flagellation, a common practice for those seeking atonement. The goal of monastic imprisonment was not just punishment but spiritual correction. Thomas was encouraged to renounce his heretical views and return to the true faith. He was visited regularly by the abbot and other monks who engaged him in theological discussions, attempting to persuade him of the error of his ways. Thomas, however, remained steadfast in his beliefs. He refused to recant. His resistance led to increasingly harsh treatment. His food was reduced, and his contact with the outside world was completely cut off. He was subjected to public humiliation, forced to wear a penitential garment and beg for forgiveness. Despite this pressure, Thomas never wavered. After years of imprisonment, his health failed. He died in his cell, still considered a heretic by the Church. Thomas's story illustrates the Church's use of imprisonment to suppress dissent and maintain religious orthodoxy. It also highlights the courage of those who stood by their beliefs, even in the face of persecution and death. These are just 3 stories, of course, but I hope they've provided a deeper understanding of the human experiences that unfolded within those dark, often forgotten spaces of medieval prisons. These weren't just structures of stone and iron, but places where lives were shaped, broken, and sometimes, surprisingly, even redeemed. Alright, let's gently wrap up our exploration of medieval prisons and drift toward a peaceful slumber, shall we? Over the past little while, we've journeyed through a world quite different from our own, a world where justice was often harsh, and confinement, well, let's just say it wasn't exactly a spa retreat. We've seen how these early prisons, or rather places of confinement, evolved from simple dungeons and makeshift holding cells into more formalized structures, often within castles, churches, and town gaols. Think back to those imposing castle keeps, serving as symbols of noble power, where imprisonment was as much a tool of political control as it was a form of punishment. And then there were the Church's ecclesiastical prisons, monasteries, and places places of penance, designed for spiritual correction. It's fascinating, isn't it, how the concept of confinement was intertwined with both secular and religious authority. The urban gaols and gatehouses we explored, those centers of incarceration within medieval towns, they offer a stark contrast, painting a picture of the everyday realities of crime and punishment for the common folk. Remember those descriptions of prison architecture? The deliberate design, or rather lack thereof, aimed at control and neglect, darkness, unsanitary conditions, all contributing to an environment that was physically and psychologically crushing. It's hard to imagine spending any significant amount of time in those places without feeling utterly hopeless. And who were the unfortunate souls trapped within these walls? A diverse bunch, really. Debtors struggling to repay their loans, petty criminals guilty of minor offenses, political prisoners challenging the status quo, and religious dissenters daring to question the established doctrines. Their stories, often lost to history, provide glimpses into the social and political tensions of the time. Let's not forget the grim realities of daily life inside those prisons. The meager rations, the appalling hygiene, the constant threat of disease. It's a stark reminder of how precarious life could be, even without the added misery of incarceration. And then there were the economics of imprisonment, the gaolers relying on fees from prisoners, creating opportunities for corruption and abuse. A system where justice was often secondary to profit, a rather unsettling thought, isn't it? The forms of torture and punishment inflicted within those prison walls are truly disturbing to contemplate, aren't they? Brutal methods used to extract confessions, punish inmates, and maintain order. It's a dark chapter in human history, highlighting the depths of cruelty that humans are capable of inflicting on one another. The social hierarchy within prisons, the power dynamics, the exploitation of the weak, all reflect the inequalities of medieval society as a whole. Even within those confined spaces, social structures persisted, with trustees and other inmates finding ways to exert dominance over their fellow prisoners. Then there were the escapes and uprisings, the desperate attempts to reclaim freedom and rebel against unjust imprisonment. These acts of defiance, however rare, offer a glimmer of hope amidst the darkness, a testament to the human spirit's enduring desire for liberty. It's particularly important to remember the experiences of women in medieval prisons. Their vulnerability to sexual assault and exploitation, their often unjust imprisonment. It's a reminder of the specific challenges and injustices faced by women in a patriarchal society. And the political prisoners, those individuals imprisoned for their beliefs or actions, their stories highlight the use of prisons as tools of power and control, a chilling reminder of how easily justice can be subverted for political gain. The Inquisition's use of imprisonment to suppress heresy and maintain religious orthodoxy is another example of this, showcasing the dark side of religious authority. Let's not forget those imprisoned for debt, a cruel fate for those struggling with financial hardship. The social implications of this practice, the way it trapped individuals and families in cycles of poverty, it's a reminder of the importance of social safety nets and economic justice. And of course, there were the royal prisons, the Tower of London, and other high-security facilities, housing some of the most famous and infamous figures of the medieval period. Their walls echo with tales of intrigue, betrayal, and political machinations. We also touched on the issue of prison labor, the exploitation of inmates for profit, and the debate over whether such labor was punitive or rehabilitative. It's a question that continues to be debated to this day, isn't it? The legal system, or rather the lack thereof, surrounding imprisonment, the absence of standardized procedures, the potential for abuse, it's a reminder of the importance of due process and legal safeguards. Without these protections, imprisonment can easily become a tool of oppression. And what about public perceptions of prisons? The fear, the curiosity, the moral judgments. These attitudes shaped the way prisons were run and the way prisoners were treated, and they continue continue to influence our views on crime and punishment today. It's also important to note the shift from private prisons to state control late in the medieval period. This transition reflects a changing understanding of the role of government in administering justice and maintaining order. And then there were those early reform movements, those voices for change, advocating for improved conditions and greater fairness within the prison system. Their efforts, however limited, paved the way for future reforms. And through those case studies, the stories of individual prisoners and their fates, we saw the broader themes of medieval imprisonment come to life. Their experiences, though unique, reflect the systemic issues of justice, power, and social inequality that permeated medieval society. So what is the legacy of medieval prisons? What impact do they have on modern penal systems? Well, in many ways, they laid the groundwork for the prison systems we have today. The concept of confinement as a form of punishment, the use of prisons as tools of social control, these ideas have their roots in the medieval period. Of course, modern prisons are, in theory, more humane, with greater emphasis on rehabilitation and due process. But the challenges of overcrowding, underfunding and abuse remain, reminding us that the struggle for justice and fairness within the penal system is far from over. The medieval period also saw the beginnings of our modern ideas on penology, like the concepts of deterrence and retribution, and even rehabilitation of offenders. Think of it, we're still grappling with those same ideas today. The legacy of medieval prisons also serves as a cautionary tale, a reminder of the dangers of unchecked power, the importance of due process, and the need for constant vigilance against injustice. It's a reminder that our systems of justice and correction need to be constantly evaluated and reformed. So as we drift off to sleep, let's remember the lessons we've learned from our journey into the dark world of medieval prisons. Let's remember the importance of justice, fairness, and compassion. And let's strive to create a world where imprisonment is used only as a last resort, and where all individuals are treated with dignity and respect. And now, my friend, sweet dreams.